Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar. For those of you who are new to the ParaBoss platform, ParaBoss is Australia's resource for the control of worms, lice, flies, and ticks in cattle, sheep, and goats. It's a joint initiative from AWI, Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England, and Animal Health Australia. And today we're going to be talking all about ticks, getting a jump on ticks in spring, and we will be joined by Dr. Lee Taylor, who I will formally introduce you to in just a moment. For those of you who haven't been on our webinar before, my name is Fiona MacArthur and I'm a member of the ParaBoss Extension team. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later. So there, you'll notice on your platform, there's a Q&A tab and there's also a chat tab. And I'd really appreciate it if you could use these for two different things. So the Q&A is for please type all your questions in here to the Q&A tab for Lee. And that's going to be after his presentation. We'll have a nice little Q&A session. So I'll collate all your questions during the presentation. So type them in at any time, but the Q&A tab is just questions for Lee. In the chat function that you'll see, I would appreciate if you just pop any questions in for me. If you're having problems with anything, let me know and I'll have a look in the chat function there. So I'm just going to share and launch the poll for you now. There are a couple of questions in the poll. It's all anonymous, so I really do appreciate you all taking part in it. It's helpful for us here at ParaBoss and also for Lee before he kicks off today's presentation to get a bit of a feel for the audience. So the first question is, what is your industry role? Cattle producer, advisor, education, or other? And the second question, where are you located? Queensland, New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, South Australia, WA, the Northern Territory, Tasmania, or international? So we've nearly got about 80% of participants have got their responses in. So I'll just leave it open for a little bit. Be a bit of internet lag my end. Okay, I'm just going to end that poll now and I'll share the results with everybody on screen. So we have today 20% cattle producers, 39% advisors, 2% education and 39% other. If you'd like to pop in the chat function actually where you're from other than that, that would be great and I can pop them in as options going forward. And where are you located? 32% Queensland, 49% New South Wales and the ACT, 2% from Victoria, 2% from South Australia, 12% from over at WA, no one from the Northern Territory today or Tasmania, and 2% from international. We'd love to know what country you're from. Thanks for joining us today. So you can pop that in the chat function too. So I'll stop sharing that now and I'll stop sharing my screen and I'd love to invite Lee to share his screen. And why Lee is doing that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to Lee. If you haven't met Dr. Lee Taylor before, he's a veterinarian with Zoetis where he has worked for 17 years, working mostly across Northern Australia. Prior to this, Lee worked for 9 years as a government veterinarian based in Billa in central Queensland. This has given Lee a considerable experience with cattle ticks and tick fever up north. And since graduating from the University of Queensland in 1988, Lee has also worked as a private veterinary practice. He also completed his master's degree in beef cattle herd health, at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada in 1993 and became a member of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Sciences Epidemiology chapter in 1994. So we're very privileged to have Lee with us today and I'd like to warmly welcome him to today's presentation. I have your presentation up on screen now, Lee. I can see it, so I'll hand the reins over to you. And I'll come back in and join you for our Q&A session. So don't forget to pop your questions in, everybody. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Fiona. And yeah, welcome to getting a jump on ticks this spring. So we'll just run through a number of things today. We'll talk a little bit about the current challenges with cattle tick control, a little bit about being proactive and not reactive and treating on the spring rise, and sustainability of chemical products or products in chemical resistance, and some of the ParaBoss tools to aid with decision making around tick control. So some of the challenges of sustainable tick control in the current climate, we've seen a move towards more flatback and composite cattle and Wagyu cattle in the tick infested zone. The dairy cattle population in the tick infested zone is certainly decreasing all of the time, but just because of in the pursuit of meat quality, I guess people are certainly moving away from higher grade Brahmins toward more composite cattle. There's certainly some opportunities within those composites to select for tick resistance still, but certainly in the Wagyu space, they are a breed which is more susceptible to ticks, although they seem to handle them reasonably well. There's certainly a greater, because of that, there is a greater reliance on Acaricide for tick control, and we're seeing an increasing trend towards Acaricide resistance to certainly to the OP, SP, dips, and amitraz. So resistance to any or all of those. So we've seen a general trend towards an increase in Ultimo resistance, and then we've also seen an increase in fluazeron resistance over time. Resistance of internal parasites to the ML, so that unfortunately we still have, we do not have documented ML resistance in ticks in Australia, but we've certainly seen other issues associated with the reliance of on ML chemicals for ivermectin, moxidectin, doramectin, the macrocyclic lactone chemical group, and relying on those products for tick control has inadvertently led to selection for resistance to internal parasites. And that's been a trend that has been happening for some time now. It's first documented in dairy cattle in Queensland back in the mid-2000s. There's always challenges with timing of treatments, and one of the focuses we're going to talk about today is trying to treat on the spring rise, but there's certainly some challenges with doing that, and we'll discuss those. So just a review of tick biology. So we've got essentially two parts to our cattle tick life cycle. We've got a parasitic stage where the larvae attach to a host. They molt, they become a nymph, and then they ingest more blood and they molt again. And the male and female ticks will mate, and then the female ticks will go on to engorge and then drop off the host and lay eggs. And that timing of that process is around 18 to 21 days. And then there is a free living stage in the life cycle where the eggs will eventually hatch into larvae, and then those larvae can survive on the pasture for variable periods of time. Each tick will lay around 3,000 eggs, which is important when we're talking about the spring rise, because you can see a very rapid increase in the tick population under favourable conditions because of that. So those larvae, or the larvae well, the egg to larvae stage generally takes around 3 weeks for them to hatch, and then the larvae to get out, find their way out onto a blade of grass, and then seek out another host. But that period, that free living period on the pasture can be quite extended. Those larvae can certainly survive for extended periods up to 5 months. It would be, as required, 5 to 6 months. If they can certainly survive over the winter, and that's an important part of the biology of cattle ticks. So it's really important. What we're emphasising today is the importance of treating ticks beginning in September, with the aim of preventing them from laying eggs for a period of time over the spring, and ultimately preventing the build-up of pasture or contamination of pasture with larvae, so that come our good summer rains in December, we don't see an explosion in the tick population. So this is just looking at the same information in a different way. This is from a study that looked at or measured the larval and engorged female populations in a mob of cattle in southeast Queensland over a 12-month period, and you can see a big drop-off in the tick population, both larval ticks and engorged female ticks over the winter months, and that's associated with winter, with cold temperatures. That prevents ticks from completing their life cycle, so that they basically there's very few eggs that will survive or that go through to larvae during that period. So we have a depletion in the population of larval ticks on the pasture, and the adult engorged females drop off, but basically don't successfully produce eggs during, or produce larvae during that period, so that larval population is depleted. And then in spring, we have the onset of warm, wet weather, a few showers, favourable temperatures for ticks to complete their life cycle. For a period, the engorged female tick population on cattle does not appear significant, but the larval population on pastures does increase rapidly at this time, and this can lead to, so that from basically from October through to November and early December, you'll see small numbers of ticks on the cattle, but the pasture will be becoming more and more contaminated with larval ticks. So we see a bit of a depression in tick numbers, or adult tick numbers on cattle associated with very hot conditions during summer. And then when we move into our wet season, typical wet season conditions in January, February, the tick population will literally explode. And certainly there's a big difference in terms of success of basically the whole emphasis of today is to encourage people to treat on that spring rise when the adult tick population is low, to prevent the build-up of pasture or on pasture of larval ticks. And that's really, and it's about preventing this this massive increase in adult ticks or engorged female ticks later in the season, which is what gets people concerned. It can take a lot of repeated treatments to achieve any sort of tick control once you move out into, or once you allow the tick population to increase during that period of, or the later summer period. And certainly the period that we've just been through, we've had a run of wetter than average years, and certainly this last summer we had a fairly dry summer, but then we did get our wet season rains in February and March, and the tick population literally did explode this year, and a lot of producers were very disappointed, I guess, with the treatments that treatment success that they were achieving in March and April because of that, if they had waited until then to do anything about their tick population. I would point out that the CSIRO did produce a really good video on cattle tick. This was produced in 1962, but it is still as relevant today as the day that it was produced. It has some fantastic footage in it of what happens at the pasture level in terms of ticks laying eggs and then the larvae hatching and finding their way out onto the pasture and seeking out a new host. And that footage is certainly worth a look. If you just Google fighting the cattle tick or cattle tick movie CSIRO, you'll pull up that video, and it has some really good footage. You can certainly also see they got great footage of engorged female ticks dropping off cattle. Just to, yeah, it would be considering the age of the footage, it's pretty amazing stuff. So as we talked about, the treating on the spring rise is ultimately the way to achieve the best control of cattle ticks. This certainly isn't anything new. The first strategy of 5 treatments with a plunge tip or spray race, 18 to 21 days apart, is talked about in the video that I just pointed you to, and it's been around for a long time. We now have other available treatments that can also be used, provided they're effective. So in the poron space, there is fluazeron. So up to 3 treatments of fluazeron can be administered 42 days apart. Or again, with a poron ML, you might look at 5 successive treatments of moxidectin poron 21 days apart. There are also injectable MLs available, and the options there are 4 treatments 28 days apart with ivermectin or doramectin, or 2 successive treatments with a long-acting moxidectin injection at the minimum retreatment interval of 56 days. So all of those strategies are aimed at preventing female ticks from getting to the egg-laying stage of their life cycle during the spring. And the time to start depends very much on where people are located and also the seasonal conditions, but certainly at the beginning of spring, certainly at the start of September, all across the tick-infested area of Queensland, people need to start checking their cattle carefully for ticks. One thing I meant to point out too before, with the previous slide, with our 2 slides back, with our seasonal trends with our cattle tick population, that does vary across Queensland. Certainly, the dip in the tick population during the winter months or the dry season is less pronounced the further north you go, but there will still be a seasonal pattern. Probably the only place where this is less likely to, where that dip is not as pronounced as in the wet tropics, and that's simply because the ticks it's warm enough and wet enough for ticks to complete their life cycle at all stages of the year. So in terms of sustainable tick control, people need to look to identify and combine effective treatments. That's a general recommendation, and the emphasis there is on effective treatments, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It is the other general recommendation is to use products from different chemical groups or actives from different chemical groups. So not simply rotating the brand, but rotating all the chemical in many cases, because some, certainly within the ML group, there are a number of different chemical actives that are all MLs, so doramectin, moxidectin, ivermectin, abamectin are all macrocyclic lactones, and if you get the resistance mechanisms are similar or the same for all of those chemicals. Likewise, there are different different actives, or sorry, different brand names of products that are SP or OP dips and sprays, and also Emitraz based products, and a number of different products, different brand name products that contain fluazeron. So always read the label, understand what active it is that you are applying, and wherever possible, use different chemical actives throughout the season to control ticks, rather than repeatedly relying on the same chemical active throughout the season. There are a number of non-chemical strategies that can also be applied in the dairy space, where dairy cows are put onto a feed pad. It's certainly advisable there to, where possible, keep the cows on the feed pad during the night, because most of the engorged female ticks are drop off the cattle in the early morning, and if they're on a bare feed pad, those ticks don't have the opportunity to complete their life cycle. They just get trampled into the dirt. There's no place for them to complete their life cycle, basically. So that is a strategy that can be used in the dairy space to reduce pasture contamination. In the beef space, if people have cows that are calving and are difficult to treat in the spring, they could basically keep those cows and calves in one paddock, and then after they calve, move them into a clean paddock that has been spelled and treat them for ticks. Those ticky paddocks can then be followed up with steers that have been treated with products like fluazeron, for example, or a long-acting moxidectin product, and they can be used to essentially sweep up any larval ticks from that paddock, but the chemical treatment on those animals will prevent them from completing their life cycle. So it's a way to clean up a dirty paddock. Pasture or paddock spelling with ticks needs to be done for a long period of time in order for it to be effective. During the summer months, you'd need a 3-month spell to have any impact on tick numbers, and 5-month spell over winter months to reduce the number of seed ticks on a pasture. As I mentioned earlier, where people are relying on ML-based chemicals for tick control, it is incredibly important to be conscious of the impact that can have on internal parasites. We've certainly seen a significant increase in resistance to MLs and internal parasites where MLs have been relied upon for controlling cattle ticks. Certainly there are now pour-on and injectable combinations of MLs and levemizole, which are registered, also have a registered tick control claim, and where appropriate, they should be used. Bearing in mind that repeated use of those products can also ultimately result in resistance to both those actives if they're not managed carefully. So the ParaBoss site, or the TickBoss site within ParaBoss, has some really good materials, just providing information about where to check cattle for ticks. Cattle ticks have preferred hidey holes on cattle, the base of the tail, the escutcheon in between the back legs, around the scrotum and the udder, in the flanks, on the neck, and withers. Certainly, in the areas that cattle can't easily groom, and also in the ears. So they're certainly spots to check when you are, particularly early in the spring, if you've got cattle in the yards, just check them for any evidence of ticks in those locations, because they're, you might be looking at the cattle and thinking that they're not particularly ticky, but closer inspection may reveal otherwise. So very important where possible, and where cattle are in the yards at that time, during the spring, just to check them carefully for evidence of ticks and decide whether or not to begin your treatment. So just a little bit on Acaricide resistance. This I did check with that this information was produced a number of years ago, or printed in an MLA feedback magazine in 2021. I have checked that this is still current, and it is. So, as I said, we've seen evidence of fluaziron resistance is now quite widespread. We've seen OP and SP resistance being common in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales. Emitraz resistance is also on the rise in Queensland and northern New South Wales. Certainly in reference to northern New South Wales, that's where tick outbreaks have occurred. In Western Australia, they've been very lucky. They haven't had any reports of resistant ticks. In the Northern Territory, they are quite proactive in trying to prevent the movement of resistant ticks around the Northern Territory. So they've zoned off an area where they identified SP and OP resistance in the northern part of the Northern Territory, what are referred to as Parkhurst strain of ticks, and have some strategies in place to try and prevent those from being becoming more widespread. As I mentioned, macrocyclic lactones, or the mectins, still have good reported efficacy against ticks. And we're very fortunate in Australia that we haven't yet seen resistance to ML. I would point out, however, that ML resistance has been documented in South America and has been for some time. So it's probably not a case of it, but when we will see resistance or ticks that are resistant to MLs in Australia. I would very much encourage you to do some resistance testing. It's a free service from the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. Not sure what arrangements are in place in other states. In New South Wales, it would be the inspectors that would be doing any testing if they're doing it. But you know, it all actually is done by the staff at Coopers Plains. That does require, there are some specific requirements around the collection of ticks for resistance testing. You need 30 to 60 engorged ticks, so they need to be the big fat ones, not the flat ones. There needs to be no history of treatment for the previous 49 days. Any previous treatment, particularly with persistent chemicals like fluazuron or long-acting moxidectin, can impact the outcome of the testing. It is very important that if you have an apparent lack of efficacy, that you do some sort of investigation to find out why. It may be that there are other factors that may explain apparent lack of efficacy, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute, but it is very important to rule out resistance. And more importantly, it's important to know what works and what doesn't work on your property. And that is allows you to select from, you know, instead of relying on one or two chemical actives, that will allow you to select from a broader range of potential actives for tick control on your property, and hopefully maintain the efficacy of the actives that you currently have. Resistance to or resistance mechanisms in ticks have been described now for amitraz and for SP and OP resistance. So that it's well documented that if you give amitraz a bit of a spell, after 3 years, you'll see reversion to susceptibility. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen with SP and OP resistance. It tends to hang around. Once it's established in a tick population, it doesn't go away. Very important that people understand how the products that they're using work. Fluazuron only works on ticks that are growing. Don't use it during the winter or dry season. It just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is the ticks will not be actively growing. Therefore, it doesn't have the opportunity to do what it does. One of the important things to understand about fluazuron is that it does require body fat in order for persistence. Basically, it binds to body fat and then is slowly leached back into the animal system, and that is how it persists. And lactation impacts its persistent activity. You don't need to treat the calves on treated cows. However, the cows that have got calves at foot, you'll see less persistent activity with that product. With the dips and sprays, they kill on contact, but the critical thing is that they're applied at the correct concentration. So dips must be checked regularly and topped up where required. And I still talk to a lot of producers in Southeast Queensland who are hand spraying their cattle. It is very difficult to effectively apply SP and OP or amitraz products by hand spray to any number of cattle. I'd really discourage that. The macrocyclic lactones, ticks must, with these products, ticks have to suck blood in order for them to work, even with porons. And they also do require a degree of body fat for persistence, especially with moxidectin, which also binds to body fat and then is released back into the system over time. One of the things to understand is that, that there's a degree of misunderstanding about how these products work. I've read statements to the effect that they don't kill ticks on cattle for 5 days. Well, they do kill ticks within a 24 to 48 hour period. Depends a little bit, does vary a little bit between chemicals, but they kill the ticks relatively quickly. The problem you have is that engorged female ticks don't suck blood in the last 3 days of their life cycle. And if they don't suck blood, they're not going to be killed by this product. Larval ticks are also difficult to kill because they also suck small amounts of blood. And this is the reason for the statement on the product label warning that treated cattle may drop viable egg-laying ticks for 3 to 4 days after treatment, depending on which product label you read. And it's just to do with tick biology. It's not to do with the efficacy of the product. And the regulatory guidelines allow 6 to 9 days after treatment for clearance, or for cattle to become tick-free prior to inspection for clearance. The other thing to understand is that the ML chemicals kill ticks by paralysis. So the ticks may stay attached to the host or stay in the coat, even though they are dead. And also note that the persistency claims for cattle ticks include the life cycle of the tick. So if it says that it prevents the development, the label says, claims will say it prevents the development of viable egg-laying cattle ticks for 21, 28, 56 day or 51 days, I think it is, for long-acting moxidectin. That includes the 21-day life cycle of the tick. Finally, I would encourage you to use tick fever vaccine to control tick fever, particularly if you are actively suppressing the tick population on your property. The one thing that I would disagree with in the CSIRO tick video is the statement that, you know, you've got to maintain a few ticks on your cattle so that you don't get tick fever. That's certainly been a statement that's been made over and over. However, a lot of work was done, particularly in the mid-90s. We've got very good blood tests for antibodies to tick fever organisms, and certainly that testing demonstrated that endemic stability of the tick fever organisms is a furphy. Certainly Bos indicus cattle do have some resistance, inherent resistance to babesiosis, but they can still get and die from anaplasmosis. So take advantage of the tick fever vaccine. It's now a very, very good product, and is literally the only way to reliably prevent tick fever. I would direct you to the ParaBoss tools, or the cattle tick control tools on the ParaBoss website. A lot of time and effort has gone into creating these. There's some fantastic material there. Literally everything you need to know about tick control is now on the ParaBoss website. Work your way through it. There's a tremendous volume of information there. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll go back to Fiona for some questions.
Thanks, Lee. Just starting my video back up. It was a bit slow there. So you can pop your questions in the Q&A tab for Lee, but we will kick off with the questions that are already there. So Lee, and feel free to go back to any of your slides if it helps answer the question. We have some time for that. First one is from Michael. What do you mean by the tick infested zone? This came up quite early in the presentation.
So Australia is did have was going to put in a map of Australia showing the cattle tick infested zone. Cattle ticks, the important thing to understand is that, so we talk about the tick line, and that is the demarcation between where cattle ticks occur and don't occur in Australia. That is if that tick line and those regulated clearance treatments weren't in place when cattle were moved across that tick line, we would see cattle ticks over a very much larger part of Australia. So that tick line and that cattle tick infested zone are not the natural distribution of cattle ticks. As people in northern New South Wales would know, cattle ticks quite happily exist in northern New South Wales, and if it weren't for all of the efforts that are maintained to keep that area free of ticks, there would be cattle ticks as prevalent in northern New South Wales as what they are in southeast Queensland. And certainly that would extend right down the coast in New South Wales, probably as far as Sydney or further south during the summer months. It would be much more seasonal, but we would see cattle ticks seasonally in a large part of southern Australia if it wasn't for the efforts that are and the money that is spent on keeping ticks confined to the part of northern Australia where we currently keep them, if you like.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks, Michael, for that question. Next question, with your emergence of resistant internal parasites and the frequent drenching, have you considered co-treatments with other oral internal parasite action families?
Yep, that you can certainly use also use oral BZ drenches, but and a number of other products. So you can use oral levemizole products as well, but the only currently registered combination products that contain anything other than MLs with a cattle tick claim are the ones that are an ML levemizole combination. There's not the only oral ML combination product doesn't have a tick control claim.
Next question, Lee. What would you recommend as a protocol for moving cattle in and out of the tick zone?
There's a range of things that people can do. Certainly, it's probably the most important thing for people to know is what products are going to be effective. But an ML treatment 6 to 9 days prior to clearance, preferably an injectable product, and then it is important though for people to understand that if their cattle are heavily infested with ticks and do have engorged female ticks or near engorged female ticks on them, that they need to plan ahead. You may need to do a pre-clearance treatment to clean cattle up prior to that pre-clearance treatment, just to ensure that you don't have large numbers of engorged female ticks on your cattle if you are relying on an ML for that pre-clearance treatment. And then some people are lucky, they can they may be able to just clear with 2 dips, and that's 4 to 7 days apart. If you've still got ticks on your property that are susceptible to dips and you have access to a dip, that is that is probably the quickest and easiest way to clear cattle. But the problem we now have is that resistance to all of the available dips and sprays, so the SPs and OPs and Amitraz is now such that some people can't do that anymore. They have to use an ML treatment. Then the inspection treatment if you're using an ML can be another ML. It needs to be a different chemical. So and that is to avoid the problems with the retreatment intervals and residues. So it's going to depend very much on what the resistance status is of the ticks on your property. Certainly, it becomes a real challenge where you're trying to clear ticks at sale yards and things like that, where cattle are coming from lots of different properties. That presents a real challenge because you're potentially dealing with a whole range of different susceptibilities. And to be safe, if you're wanting a treatment that works, literally the only thing you could rely on for clearance would be 2 ml treatments in those situations now.
Lee, 2 questions here from Sandra. Do you recommend using a tick control when weaning, firstly, and also does burning help control ticks?
So tick control at weaning, weaning time, people always get concerned about ticks that they see on their cattle at weaning. It's at the end of the weaning is always, in most cases, at the end of summer, and that's when you're going to see the most ticks on your animals. Certainly, if there are reasonable tick burdens on cattle, it can affect performance, and there certainly may be benefits in treating tick burdens. Then there's certainly a recommendation to treat in the autumn. If you do a suppressive treatment in the spring, you may need to do a tidy up treatment in the autumn on cattle prior to the winter, just to reduce pasture contamination that little bit further going into the winter. But it would depend very much on the burdens that you're talking about. If there's only a few ticks there and the cattle are otherwise healthy, going into the winter months, those ticks will ultimately die because of the onset of winter or the dry season. That they'll fall off and won't complete their life cycle. In terms of burning, it's not going to have enough of an impact on tick populations to be a reliable means of cleaning up paddocks. The thing that has the most impact on tick populations is the weather. A good frost kills a lot more tick larvae than any fire will.
Great, thanks, Lee. That brings us to the end of our questions. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Lee for joining us today for this presentation. It was very timely coming into spring in the next month. So thank you, Lee, for taking the time out of your day to share your knowledge with us.
Thank you.